This PowerPoint presentation is part 1 of 3 of the digestive system. Just a few things to remember before we get into digestion, and we'll start with the fact that all chemical digestion is accomplished by way of hydrolysis. Remember, the term hydrolysis means hydrolysis, breaking or bursting apart a bond with water. And we need to remember that the structure of carbohydrates, triglycerides, and proteins will determine how they are digested. We also need to remember that the effects of pH on enzymes is going to be important in digestion due to the fact that different regions of our gastrointestinal tract will have various levels of acidity or alkalinity, and that the modes of membrane transport in the intestines is going to be very specific for different nutrients. That being said, let's take a look at the organs in the digestive system. Our digestive canal, or alimentary canal, is a muscular tube that extends from the mouth to the anus and is approximately 25 feet long in a living person. It extends and becomes 35 feet long when a person is deceased. These organs include the mouth, the pharynx, which is a fancy word for your throat, the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, and the anus. There are accessory organs in the digestive system, which include the teeth, the tongue, the gallbladder, the salivary glands, liver, and pancreas. Now, there are other body systems that contribute to the actions of the digestive system. For instance, the cardiovascular system helps make sure that we have blood supply to organs of the digestive system so that we have oxygen and nutrients going to the organs of the digestive system. Our endocrine system makes sure that we have hormones that can regulate secretion in digestive glands and accessory organs. Our integumentary system helps protect the digestive organs, as well as synthesizes vitamin D for the absorption of calcium. Our lymphatic system includes mucus-associated lymphatic tissue, which helps defend against pathogens. We also have lacteals, which absorb lipids, and lymph vessels that help to transport lipids. Our muscular system includes skeletal muscles, which support and protect the abdominal organs. The nervous system includes sensory and motor neurons that help to regulate secretions and contractions throughout the digestive tract. Our respiratory system helps provide oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. The skeletal system helps protect and support digestive organs. And the urinary system helps in terms of converting vitamin D into its active form that occurs in the kidneys, and that allows for calcium absorption in the small intestines. So our bodies are not separate and distinct systems. Everything works together to help everything else function. When we look at the histology of the alimentary canal, we can see that for the most part it's comprised of 4 distinct tissues. We have the mucosa, which is the innermost layer closest to the lumen or the opening of the canal, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. The mucosa, again, is the innermost layer closest to the lumen, and that consists of 3 portions: the inner epithelial layer, which includes goblet cells, enteroendocrine cells, enzyme-secreting cells. It's highly mitotic, as most epithelial tissue is. The next layer deep to the epithelium is the lamina propria, which consists of loose connective tissue, blood and lymphatic vessels, and mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues. And then finally the muscularis mucosa, which is smooth muscle that provides constant tension to pull the stomach and small intestines into folds, which help to enhance secretion and absorption. Now, the histology of the alimentary canal that we're showing you is true from the lower portion of the esophagus, where it joins the stomach, to the anal canal. The next layer deep to the mucosa layer is the submucosa. The submucosa layer is made up of dense irregular connective tissue that helps connect the mucosa to the muscularis. It also contains blood and lymphatic vessels, and it's in the submucosa where we find the submucosal plexus. This plexus is referred to sometimes as Meissner's plexus or the plexus submucosus, and it lies in the submucosa of the intestinal wall. Nerves of this plexus, and remember that the term plexus just means network, are derived from the myenteric plexus, which itself is derived from the plexuses of the parasympathetic nerves around the superior mesenteric artery. The muscularis layer is usually referred to as the muscularis externa, and that is a layer of smooth muscle tissue organized in two different orientations. The innermost layer of the muscularis externa is a circularly oriented muscle, whereas the external portion of the muscularis externa is the longitudinal layer, so that the alimentary canal can squeeze and then shorten, and then squeeze and shorten, squeeze and shorten, squeeze and shorten to move food through the alimentary canal in waves known as peristaltic waves or peristalsis. The proximal and distal regions of the alimentary canal are actually made up of skeletal muscle, and in the stomach there's an innermost layer, so there's 3 layers in the stomach, and that is an oblique layer of smooth muscle. When we get to the large intestines or the colon, the longitudinal muscle is no longer present around the entire alimentary canal at that point. It actually turns into 3 longitudinal bands of smooth muscle known as the tinea coli, and that extends from the base of the appendix to the junction of the sigmoid colon and the rectum, or the rectosigmoid junction. The serosa is found in the abdominal region of the alimentary canal, and we have an inner layer of visceral peritoneum followed by areolar connective tissue and the simple squamous epithelium in between the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. Remember that those serous membranes fold back on themselves. So there's simple squamous epithelium on the inside of the serosa. The serosa helps to hold the alimentary canal in place in the abdominal cavity. It also forms the mesentery, and that mesentery, that connective tissue, links the organs to the abdominal wall and also provides a passageway for blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. There are more folds of connective tissue that help to anchor and protect the digestive organs in the abdominal cavity, and these connective tissues form fused folds of peritoneum that help to attach the abdominal organs to one another and again help to anchor them to the wall of the abdominal cavity. There are 2 omenta. There is the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. The lesser omentum attaches the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver, whereas the greater omentum helps to connect the greater curvature of the stomach to the transverse colon, and then it continues as it folds over the intestines, forming kind of like an apron. And the greater omentum also contains a lot of adipose connective tissue, again to help protect the abdominal cavity contents. When it comes to nervous control of the alimentary canal, we've got two main systems that regulate this. There's an intrinsic enteric nervous system. By the way, enteric means intestines. So the enteric nervous system is intrinsic control for motility, the regulation of secretion, and responsiveness, where networks or plexuses work in concert with one another. There are two networks involved in the enteric nervous system, sometimes referred to as the brain within the gut, and those include the submucosal plexus, which regulates movement of the muscularis mucosae, as well as glandular secretion, and the myenteric plexus, which controls peristalsis and segmentation. External control involves the autonomic nervous system, where we have extrinsic innervation by way of the sympathetic and parasympathetic vagus nerve response. Remember that the vagus nerve is the wandering nerve. It goes everywhere, and that's the biggest player in the parasympathetic nervous system. Both the enteric plexuses and the vagus nerve work together to control gastric secretion. There are additional folds of the peritoneum, including the falciform ligament, which helps to anchor the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and inferior diaphragm. The mesentery, as I mentioned before, but I want to point this out because there's a really nice picture on the slide at the bottom that anchors all the small intestines except for the duodenum. And then there's the mesocolon, which attaches the transverse and sigmoid colon to the posterior abdominal wall. Peritonitis is a condition where there's inflammation of the peritoneum. It can be caused by chemicals, hemorrhage, bacteria. It can be something that turns into a life-threatening problem, because if an individual has peritonitis, that could lead to septicemia. If an individual does have peritonitis, oftentimes that person will need to have surgery or some very heavy-duty antibiotic therapy. The digestive processes include ingestion, mechanical digestion, propulsion, chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. We begin the process of ingestion by taking food into the mouth and chewing it, which is known as mastication, and swallowing, which is known as deglutition. That helps to mechanically break down food while mixing the food with amylase, which helps to break down carbohydrates, and lingual lipase, which helps to break down fats. Food then goes through the propulsion processes, which include voluntary and involuntary actions. Swallowing is actually a two-phase voluntary buccal and involuntary pharyngeal esophageal process, which begins peristalsis. When we look at propulsion, peristalsis is that part of propulsion which continues both chemical and mechanical digestion. However, it does continue mechanical digestion because there are alternating waves of contractions that send the bolus of food, which is what we call the food mixed with saliva, from the mouth to the stomach by way of the esophagus. Propulsion will continue through all the way to the rectum, and segmentation, which causes more mechanical mixing, will also continue through the small intestines. And in this slide, you can really see the difference between peristalsis, where there's a wave pushing longitudinally, and segmentation, where things are mixed up by segments within the alimentary canal. When we look at chemical digestion more closely, we know that in the mouth we have enzymes in saliva, amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates, lingual lipase, which helps to hydrolyze fats. And in the stomach, there is an enzyme known as pepsin, which begins to break down protein. So protein breakdown begins in the stomach. However, infants produce a different protein. They produce renin to help break down casein in milk. When the bolus reaches the stomach, it starts to mix with the hydrochloric acid, forming this liquidy acid mixture known as chyme. And as we said before, the primary digestive enzymes involved are amylase, breaking down carbohydrates, lipase, breaking down fats. The pepsin in the stomach helps to break down proteins into large peptides, but then the small intestines and pancreas can also produce peptidase, which further helps to break down those large peptide chains. We also have protease, which is another enzyme that helps to break down proteins. When it comes to absorption, absorption in the stomach mostly includes small amounts of water, alcohol, and certain lipid-soluble drugs like aspirin, and to a lesser extent, some simple sugars and amino acids, depending on the level of pH in the stomach. However, the majority of nutrient absorption happens in the small intestines, not in the stomach. When it comes to regulating digestion, there are 3 different ways of controlling digestive processes with the nervous system, including information that is going to be sensed by mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, and osmoreceptors. Neuroregulation includes the nerve plexuses that we mentioned earlier, which are embedded in the walls of the alimentary canal. Remember that there are extrinsic controls, which are going to be involved in longer reflexes outside of the digestive system, including the central nervous system and autonomic nervous system, as well as intrinsic controls, which are the short reflexes that are controlled by the enteric nervous system that we saw earlier. As the bolus of food travels down the esophagus, it will pass through the esophageal sphincter into the stomach and land in the lower portion of the stomach. As the pepsin enzyme and the hydrochloric acid work to break apart proteins, the rising level of peptides released from the proteins or caffeine that may have been ingested, as well as rising levels of pH, will stimulate G cells in the stomach to release a hormone known as gastrin. Gastrin will stimulate parietal cells in the stomach to secrete more hydrochloric acid, and gastrin also increases the motility of the stomach. As the bolus mixes with the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, it will then pass through the pyloric sphincter little by little into the first part of the small intestines known as the duodenum. With the presence of that acid food in the duodenum will in turn release a hormone known as secretin. Secretin starts to inhibit the motility of the stomach. It's like, hey, I've got some chyme in here, you don't need to keep emptying into me. It will cause the liver to decrease its secretion of bile, and it will also cause the pancreas to increase its secretion of bicarbonate. And the reason for that is the duodenum is not designed for hydrochloric acid the way the stomach is. So we need to have the bicarbonate from the pancreas to help increase the pH so it's not too acidic and so it doesn't harm the cells in the duodenum. Now, the presence of fatty foods and amino acids in the duodenum will cause the duodenum to secrete cholecystokinin. And cholecystokinin is going to increase the flow of enzymes from the pancreas. So the pancreatic enzymes also include the enzyme trypsin from the acinar cells, as well as we mentioned before, that bicarbonate, which will help to increase the pH in the duodenum. And the cholecystokinin will cause bile secretion from the gallbladder, and that bile secretion from the gallbladder will help to emulsify the fatty foods that are present in the duodenum. The secretion of hydrochloric acid and its presence in the intestines also causes intestinal cells to release enteric gastrin, which briefly stimulates the gastric glands to make more hydrochloric acid. This increased stimulation of production of hydrochloric acid will stimulate what's known as the enterogastric reflex, which is a trio of inhibition of the vagal nuclei, inhibition of local reflexes, as well as sympathetic activation of the pyloric sphincter to tighten to prevent more food from entering the small intestines, as well as putting a brake on the stomach. So if we take a look at this picture, we can see that beginning with chyme coming into the duodenum, as chyme enters into the duodenum, there is a reflex that begins with sensory stretch receptors being stimulated, and that sends sensory nerve impulses to the central nervous system by way of the vagus nerve, and then impulses come back from the central nervous system to inhibit peristalsis in the stomach wall. And that is the end of the first part of 3 for the digestive system.